Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today I'm going to be painting up one of the new Warrior of Rohan models from the brand new starter set for Middle-earth strategy battle game, The War of the Rohirrim. These are fantastic new sculpts, look really great alongside the old ones, will make great additions to your Rohan armies for your games in Middle-earth.
So it begins.
So the first thing I've done is I've primed the model black, as this will give us a nice smooth, even base coat for the rest of our colours to work from. And now the first thing I'm going to be painting on the model is all of the leather, and for this I'll be using Rhinox hide. So I'm going to apply a couple of thin coats of Rhinox hide to all of the areas of the model that I want to be leather. So that's going to be all of the armour here on the body, and this part here of the coat as well, as well as parts of the padded armour like the shin guards, arm guards and the helmet as well. I'm going to make sure I catch all of these areas with a couple of layers of Rhinox hide. So this will give us that leather armour look that's so iconic for Warriors of Rohan. Just working a couple of thin layers, building up to a solid coat of Rhinox hide all over the areas we want to be leather. After a couple of layers of Rhinox hide, you can see I've got a nice smooth coverage all over the areas that I want to be leather. So the next thing I'm going to paint is the iconic green cloak. For this I'll be using Castilian green. I'm just going to apply a couple of thin layers all over the cloak to the warrior. Obviously you want to be nice and neat when you're around the areas that we've already painted with Rhinox hide. Just make sure you catch all of the cloak with a couple of layers of Castilian green. This paint isn't going to give fantastic coverage on the first layer, so you are going to have to slowly build up over 2 or even 3 layers until we get a solid coat of Castilian green all over the cloak of the Rohan Warrior. Don't forget to paint the inside of the cloak as well, being nice and careful around the leather armour. Just catch the inside of the cloak with Castilian green as well. And after a couple of layers of Castilian green, you see I've got a solid coat all over that cloak. So the next thing I'm going to pick out a couple of the other green details on the model. First of these with some Caliban green. I'm going to paint the shield to the model. Don't have to worry about painting the inner part, we'll be painting that later. But for now, I'm just making sure I coat all of the outside of the shield with a layer of Castilian green. Once again, it's probably going to take a couple of layers to get a solid coverage. Just apply a couple of thin layers all over the shield. With the shield picked out, you can see we've got that nice Rohan green shield for the warrior. So there's just one final green detail left to pick out. And that's going to be with some Rawk flesh. I'm just going to pick out any other bits of fabric we can see on the model. So there's this little bit here showing on his leg, as well as some of the sleeves to the arms as well. Just going to carefully pick these out with some Rawk flesh. This will just break up some of the other colours, add a pop of brightness to the model, and just add some interest to our Warrior of Rohan. With those areas picked out with some Rawk flesh, the next thing I'm going to paint is the skin. For this I'll be using Bugman's Glow. I'm just going to very carefully apply a couple of layers of Bugman's Glow to the face of the model. Doesn't matter if I paint over the beard and stuff at this stage, but try and be nice and neat around all the other colours. Make sure you catch all of the face with some Bugman's Glow. Also going to pick out the hands to the model as well. So he's got one holding the shield, one holding the sword. make sure you catch these with some Bugman's Glow. With all of the skin picked out, the model's really starting to come together now. Just a few more base coats left to apply. The next one of those I'm going to apply is on the hair. For that I'll be using Avalan Sunset. I'm just going to carefully pick out all of the hair on the model, including the beard, with some Avalan Sunset. It's going to give the impression of blonde hair that so many of the Rohan Warriors have. So I'm just going to carefully pick out all of the hair with some Avalan Sunset. With all the hair popped out, we've got that pop of blonde showing from underneath his helmet. So next I'm going to paint other boots. For this I'll just be using Corvus Black. I'm just going to carefully pick out the boots to the model. With the boots picked out, next I'm going to move on to is all of the straps on the model. There's quite a few on these new Rohan Warrior sculpts. And for all the straps, I'll be using Mournfang Brown. So I'm going to be nice and careful at this stage. Just pick out all of the straps. So things like the belt here going around his waist. Making sure I carefully pick this out with some Mournfang Brown. I'm also picking any of the ones going over the leather armour on his arms and his legs as well. I'm just carefully picking these out with some Mournfang Brown. So I go all the way around, just applying a thin line all over the straps. He's also got some on the back of his legs as well. Just going to make sure I catch these with some Mournfang Brown. And with all the straps picked out, we're really moving into picking out the smallest details now. So the next of these will be the markings on the shield. For this I'll be using Celestra Grey. I'm just going to very carefully pick out all of the markings on the shield. So this sculpt here has these triangles. Carefully picking all of these out with a couple of layers of Celestra Grey. Just give us the base for a nice white markings on the shield. And I'm also going to pick out this ring going around the middle as well. Just make sure I carefully pick this out with some Celestra Grey. Try not to get any of this over the green we already painted. And with all the details on the shield picked out, the only things left to paint now are the metallics. And so for the first of these, I'll be using Lead Belcher. I'm going to carefully pick out any areas that I want to be a silver metal. So it's going to be all the areas like the sword, the trim running around his helmet and down the sides. I'm going to be really careful as I pick this out with a layer of Lead Belcher. Try not to get this over any of the other things we've already painted. All the steel picked out. The only things left to paint now are only the gold details. For this I'll be using Retributor armour. So I'm going to pick out things like the hilt and the pommel to his sword. Just carefully picking this out with a couple of layers of Retributor armour. I'm also going to paint the emblem here in the middle of his shield as well. Being really careful around the Celestra Grey. Just making sure I catch this with a couple of layers of Retributor armour. And I'm also going to pick out the detailing on the helmet as well. So he's got this horse going along the top. I'm just going to carefully pick this out with some Retributor armour. And with the Retributor armour applied, that is all of the base coats applied to the model. So the next step is going to be to shade the miniature. First shade I'm coming in with is some Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm going to apply this to all of the areas of skin and the hair on the model. So everything we paint with Bugman's Glow and Avalan Sunset. Going to make sure I shade this with some Reichland Flesh Shade, being careful that I don't get this over any of the other colours. I just get it over where I need. And now with some Athonian Camo Shade, I'm just going to paint the couple of areas I painted with Uruk Flesh. So those little bits of exposed fabric on his legs and his arms. And with some Biltan Green, I'm going to shade all of the cloak. This is a darker shade than the Athonian Camo Shade. So really darken that cape down and add some definition. So I'm just applying some Biltan Green all over the cape to our Warrior of Rohan. If you find this pulls too heavily in a recess, you can wick it away with a dry brush. And with some known oil, I'm going to apply this to all of the areas we painted with Rhinox Hide, Ledge Belcher, and Corvus Black. Just going to make sure I catch all of these areas with a shade of known oil. And we're also going to shade all over the green and white parts to the shield as well, but I'm leaving the Retributor armor. And finally, with some Agrax Earth Shade, I'm going to shade all of the areas we painted gold. So the pommel and the detailing on the helmet, as well as the part of the middle of the shield as well. I'm catching all of this with some Agrax Earth Shade.
If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below.
And after all of those shades have dried, you can see they've added definition all over the miniature. So now it's time to start highlighting. And the first area I'm going to highlight is all of the skin. So first of all, I'm coming in with some Bugman's Glow again. I'm going to carefully apply this in all the areas that the shades didn't settle on the skin. So with not a lot of exposed skin, this is going to be areas like the cheeks and the exposed bottom lip. I'm just catching some Bugman's Glow, making sure I leave the Reichland Flesh Shade in all the recesses. I'm also picking out all of the fingers, but leaving that shade in between them. Bugman's Glow applied, it's brightened up those areas that were darkened down by the shade. It's left the definition of the shades in all the recesses. And now I'm coming with some Kislev Flesh. I'm just going to add some small spot highlights. So it's going to be areas like the very tips, highest points of the cheeks, the very bottom lip, raised areas that would catch the light the most on the face. Just catching this with a spot of Kislev Flesh. And on the fingers, I'm just going to carefully pick out the knuckles. Spots like that with a small spot of Kislev Flesh. The Kislev Flesh applied, that's the skin highlighted. With a lot of it hidden under a helmet, there's not a lot of skin on this model. But next I'm going to paint the eyes just to pick them out. For that I'll be using Abaddon Black first. Just going to carefully sink this into the recess of the eye socket. Being really careful around the skin we've painted and highlighted. But just sinking a small amount of Abaddon Black into those eye recesses. And then with some White Scar, I'm just going to add a very small spot in the middle of the eye. Normally I would split this with another line of black, but as it's such a small spot, mostly covered up by the helmet, just adding a small spot of white to act like a pupil. And with the eyes picked out, it's really added some character to the model. So now with some Towel Light Ochre, I'm going to highlight the hair. For this I'm being really careful, and I'm just picking out all of the raised strands of hair that are sculpted into the model. Just applying a thin highlight of Towel Light Ochre onto all of the hairs. This will leave a bit of the avalanche sunset showing, as well as the shade in the recess, and give the impression of blonde hair flowing out from the back of his helmet. And with all the hair highlighted, that's the face painted and acting like a focal point to the model. So now I'm going to start highlighting the cloak. First of all, I'm coming in with Castilian green once again. I'm going to apply this to all the areas that the shade didn't settle on the cloak. So wherever the biltang green settled in a recess and darkened it down, I'm leaving that recess dark, but coming in on either side with some Castilian green and bringing the raised and flatter areas back up to their brighter colour. So it's worth taking time at this stage, just working your way around the model, leaving that biltang green in all of the recesses, but brightening up all of the raised points of the model with a layer of thin Castilian green, just to bring it back up to its original colour. There are a lot of creases and folds on this cloak, so just take your time, work your way around, and brighten the cloak back up. After the Castilian green's been applied, you can see how it's really accentuated the shadows in all of the recesses. So now I'm coming in with a 50-50 mix of Castilian green and Lauren Forest. I'm going to apply this in the middle of the areas that I just applied the previous layer of pure Castilian green. So to make this much thinner than the previous layer, so you can see the Castilian green showing through around the edges, but in the middle we've got a bit of this 50-50 mix. Just create a nice transition from the darkest, shadiest recesses up to our brightest highlights we'll be applying next. So just apply a bit of this mix in the middle of all the areas you applied the previous step, making sure you leave some of the pure Castilian green showing from around the edges. With that 50-50 mix applied, you can see how it's really brightened up those raised areas, giving a nice transition from dark to light. So there's just one final highlight to apply to the cloak. That's going to be an edge highlight of pure Lauren Forest. So for this you want to pick the very highest points of all of the creases and folds, very edges of the cloak, just picking all of the sharpest points with a really thin edge highlight of pure Lauren Forest. For the sharper points at the edges, you can use the side of your brush. This will give you a nice smooth line going around the edges of the cloak. For the tops of the creases and folds, just using the very tip of my paintbrush, not applying much pressure at all, so I just get a thin line going down those sharpest points, like the lights catching on the top of the creases. So once again, just work your way around the model, applying this thin edge highlight of Lauren Forest to all the sharpest points. With that edge highlight applied, that is the cloak highlighted. It's got a great transition from dark to light. So next thing I'm going to highlight is the little bits of green fabric. For this I'll be using Rawk Flesh once again. Just applying this as an edge highlight because these are small areas. So I'm just picking out the tops of the raised creases, folds, areas like that, with a thin line of Rawk Flesh. With that small edge highlights applied of Rawk Flesh. Next thing I'm going to highlight is all of the leather details. To start off with this, I'm coming with a 50-50 mix of Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown. So what I want to do here is apply this to flatter, larger and raised areas of the leather details, leaving some of the Rhinox Hide showing, as well as that shade in all of the recesses. Then over the next few steps, we're going to build up to give the impression of beaten and worn leather on these flatter and most raised areas. So just look around the model, where the shade hasn't settled so much, just apply some small spots of this mix on all the flatter and most raised areas of leather. With that mix applied, you can see how it's brightened up some of those areas of leather. So now I'm coming in with some pure Mournfang Brown, and I'm going to apply this in the middle of all of the areas we just applied the previous mix. By keeping this paint nice and thin, it's going to give you a nice smooth transition. If we work up through slightly brighter colours each time, it will get a really nice looking beaten, worn leather look to all of the armour and this jacket. So just apply some pure Mournfang Brown in the middle of where we applied the previous step, making sure you leave some of that Mournfang Brown Rhinox hide mix showing through. Don't want to go too heavy with this, but just apply it so we can build up a nice transition from dark to light. And some of the areas are quite small, so you'll just be applying tiny little spots of Mournfang Brown, but don't worry, just work your way around and apply this in the middle of all the areas we just did our previous step. And with the pure Mournfang Brown applied, you can see how we're really getting that transition from dark to light. So the next step is going to be with some Mournfang Brown and Steel Legion Drab. It's a 50-50 mix again. And now I'm just applying this sort of as an edge highlight to the sharpest points on the jacket, as well as in the middle of the areas that we just applied the pure Mournfang Brown. I'm going to keep these really thin, nice and small, and just apply small spot highlights and edge highlights on sharp points with a bit of this mix. So as we applied it to the flat areas here, just applying small spot highlights in the middle of the pure Mournfang Brown. And on sharp points here, like the corner of this jacket, I'm just applying it as a thin edge highlight. So we really just give the impression of light catching on worn leather, a bit of cracking that happens to old, beaten up leather. And with that Steel Legion Drab Mournfang Brown mix applied, you can see how it's really brightened up that leather, added interest all over it. So one final step to apply now, and that's with some Rawk stone. I'm going to pick out any of the detailing on the leather. So these parts here, coming down his side, picking out these sharp raised points at the edge with a really thin edge highlight of Rawk stone. It's got some on the leather armour on his legs and arms as well, catching these raised points. And also all of this detailing on his chest. I'm going to very carefully pick out the raised parts of this with some Rawk stone. So I'm going to be really careful. Don't get this into the recesses at all. Just picking out the sculpted in raised detail with a thin edge highlight of Rawk stone. And with that edge highlight applied, it's picked out the sharpest points to all the leather detail and added interest all over the Rohan Warrior. So now with some Scrag Brown, I'm going to highlight all of the straps on the model. So for the belt here, I'm just applying a thin edge highlight to the belt, keeping this line really thin, being really careful around all the other colours. And do the same to all the straps on the arms and the legs as well, just catching the raised points and details with some Scrag Brown. And with the straps picked out, there's only a few details left to highlight now on the model. The next one with Mechanica Standard Grey, I'm going to come in and just highlight the sharp points on the boots, raised details, sculpted in thing, edges of boots, details like that. I'm just carefully picking these out with an edge highlight, Mechanica Standard Grey. With the boots picked out, the next detail I'm going to highlight is the shield. So with some Lauren Forest first, I'm going to apply an edge highlight going around the edge of the shield. For this, you can just use the side of your brush and carefully pick out the very edge of the shield with a thin edge highlight of Rohan Forest. The edge of the shield highlighted. Next, I'm going to pick out other detailings, and for that, we'll be using White Scar. I'm just going to carefully apply an edge highlight of White Scar to all of the details on the shield. So I'm going to carefully pick out the very edges of all of these triangles, keeping my highlights as small as I can, and then I'm going to pick out the edge of this ring around the middle as well. So trying to keep this nice and small, nice and neat, just edge highlighting all of the white details on the shield. And with the shield highlighted, only a couple of steps left to go now. So with some Stormhost Silver, I'm going to highlight all of the steel details. So it's going to be edges of the sword, details like that, just applying a thin edge highlight. The same with the helmet as well. I'm just going to carefully pick out any raised details with a little bit of Stormhost Silver to give the impression of light catching on the edges of all the steel details. With the Stormhost Silver applied, the only things left to highlight now are the gold details. And for this, I'll be using Liberator Gold. I'm just going to carefully edge highlight any of the details we painted with Retributor armor earlier. So we're going to carefully catch any raised spots, edges of every detail with a really thin edge highlight of Liberator Gold. This will brighten up the gold, give the impression of light catching on raised surfaces, and just finish off the model really nicely. And with the Liberator Gold applied, that is how to paint one of the new Rohan Warrior models from the new edition of the Middle-earth strategy battle game. So please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other Middle-earth miniatures you would like to see me paint? Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, an extra special thank you to Jenkins, our Tea Lover channel member. Thank you so much for the support. And happy painting!